Well, hi there, and welcome to another week of the Good News According to Job. We are nearly at the end of this series, and it really has been fantastic being able to work through this incredible book with all of you. And I hope that it's encouraged you, not to just simply finish the series, but to really go and wrestle with Job again, read through the book a couple times, wrestling through what the book is all about, keeping in mind the big picture of the book, keeping in mind the character of Job, his uprightness, his blamelessness, his fear of the Lord, the way he shuns evil, and to keep wrestling, keep going back to see how his circumstance, his life, his situation that he finds himself in really is one that produces an incredible character in him as he is brought to the very edge of the pit, if we can put it that way, and to consider who God is, as he cries out to God, as he seeks God, as he longs to in many ways talk to God, to hear from God what is happening and what is going on in his life. And this week is significant for us because we have heard from everybody at this point. We have heard from the three friends of Job, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. We've heard from Job himself, and we've heard from Elihu. And this week we finally get to turn to hear what the Lord has to say. And this is amazing because it is going to give us an incredibly different perspective and a different voice altogether in this book of Job that really highlights something beautiful and something incredible about what God's wisdom looks like. So before we look at this passage, and we won't read the whole section this week, but before we do turn to it today, the thing that we need to just keep in mind as we do look at it is the incredible picture that is painted for us around God's wisdom. God's wisdom is not something that can be fathomed. It's not something that we can fully understand, and yet it is a question that we have. We are constantly asking ourselves the question of, well, what is happening here? Why is what is happening to Job happening to Job? And Job, in many ways, is trying to figure it out, but in the same breath, he is seeking the Lord. And in this section that we look at today, it's the first half of the Lord's discourse. The Lord paints an incredible picture for us. He paints a picture for us as he takes Job in many ways by the hand and demonstrates and shows to him the very creation that he has made. And this might seem peculiar for us. Why does he not simply answer Job directly and explain every little detail or every desire or question that Job has in his heart? But instead, what God shows Job is how magnificent and how complex the very design of his creation is. And so in light of who Job is a creature within God's creation. Job is a creature that has been designed and made by God, as is everybody else and everything else in this world that we see, that we feel, that we can experience. Everything has been created by God, whether it is things around us, people, animals, plants, and in many ways even the very things that we use today, the tools, the implements, they all tie back into something somewhere that is initially created by God. We have simply maybe repurposed it, but it is God that is the one that creates all things, all living things, all of nature, all of creation. And what we have today in this passage is God taking Job to look at his creation, but he starts in a very interesting way. He takes Job all the way back to the very creation, the very beginning of how things began. And so the section that we look at today is chapter 38 and 39, and then just the first two verses really of chapter 40. And then that will be the section that we consider of what the Lord says. And then next week we will highlight the last part of the Lord's discourse. And there is a reason for breaking it up, and we'll pick up that very briefly at the end of this video, and then maybe highlight it a little bit more as we as we turn to it next week to conclude with the Lord's Discourse. But as for this week, there is a couple things that we just want to pick up on, some bookends, as well as the contents of what's inside this incredible 2 chapters that we have here. The first bookend that we have is in verse 1. It says, "Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said." So first and foremost, before we really highlight what the bookends look like, we are told something very crucial, that the Lord himself speaks out of a storm. This might seem peculiar to us, but often we find that in the Old Testament that the Lord will speak out of his creation using natural things that we can observe and see and hear, and that's all around us. And in this context, it is painted that the Lord speaks to Job out of a storm. And furthermore, here are some of the bookends that we need to pick up on. Verse 2, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." And so we have this first bookend. This is what the Lord is about to do. He is about to challenge Job in many ways. He says, brace yourself, protect yourself. Actually cover yourself up, protect your vital organs, or your organs. He says, "I will question you, and you shall answer me." And then he says this at the end in chapter 40, verse 1 and 2. It just says, "Then the Lord said to Job, will the one who contends with Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him." So there is this call now, that the Lord says he's going to speak, he is going to say something, and ultimately the Lord is going to question, and he says, "You shall answer me." And then the Lord says again, in the end of chapter 40, in the beginning of chapter 40, he says, "Let him who accuses God answer him." So he's saying, you've accused me, fine, but now answer me. Answer me, the one who has revealed something to you. So what is what is the Lord going to question Job on, and what is he going to show? What is he going to show Job? There are some incredible things. So there are questions that the Lord does ask here, but as he asks these questions, he also shows Job through the questions. He shows Job who he is through his creation. So if you have taken the time to read chapter 38 and 39, you would have maybe picked up on some of those things. And I'm not going to read through it all. I'm going to hopefully pick up on some of the things. But there are some questions that we can highlight, just to quickly highlight them for you, at least just two as an example. The first one we have in verse 4. Listen to the question that he asks. "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions?" And so you see, these are the questions, the type of questions that he's going to ask. And then you can find again another question that comes in verse 12. "Have you ever given orders to the morning, or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it?" And so these are the kind of questions that get thrown into this passage, into this the Lord's response to Job, as Job finally, in one sense, gets to stand before God and hear what the Lord has to say. The Lord turns to him and asks him questions. But they're not just simple questions, and they're not just any questions. He asks him questions pertaining to things that we cannot control, things that we cannot rule and govern and establish in our own power or in our own might. And what he shows Job, he goes through the very creations. So the first question is, where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? He starts at creation. He says, where were you when I created all? Where were you when the very foundations of the earth were made? Listen to just a few more of these questions. He says, who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? It's a picture of almost a building site. If you've ever been on a building site, you don't simply rock up one day at a building site and the building begins to be built. it is not that simple. You need someone to come on site who has the plans, who knows how everything needs to be laid out, who knows the measurements. For a good house to be built, you can't simply start building. You need to prepare, you need to lay out the foundations, you need to measure it out, you need to make sure that everything is done according to the plans. And what makes this incredibly beautiful is that God's saying, I am the one who holds the plans. I'm the one that holds the blueprints for this very creation that you live in. And so he says, when you look at it, where were you when I was measuring the earth's foundations, the earth's, when I was creating it all? Where were you? And really, he paints this picture for us all the way up to verse 11. He continues to paint that picture of creation. If you think of Genesis language, it keeps coming to mind. Verse 11 there, I'll just read that for you as well. When I said, this far you may come and no further. Here is where your proud waves halt. And he kind of concludes this picture of the waters and how he separated the waters and how he commanded the waters to go and have a boundary, and they would not exceed that boundary. And so it's an incredible picture that's painted, one that we can connect with when we think about Genesis and see that picture, how he separated the waters from the waters above from the waters below, and those kind of pictures that get painted for us. And then he goes to explore it a little bit further. But before he does that, he asks these questions, a rather peculiar question, at least in verse 12 and 13. But then he shows a little bit more about the creation itself. He says in verse 12, as we read earlier on, have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place? So you have this picture of the morning, the sun and the moon and the rising, this day and night picture. So God created the earth. It was formless and void, and the oceans covered it. And then he created, out of chaos, he created the earth and the world. Just that picture of God creating from something that for us would seem like absolute disorder. God has the ability to control and create and order. And then you have 12. He created the sun, moon, and stars. If you think of Genesis, here he calls the morning forth, or shown the dawn its place, as it says. And then he asks this. He says, so who are you? Are you able to call the morning forth, or show the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? And so he is highlighting that there's this aspect to it that he is highlighting that says, well, who are you to actually not only call the morning forth but expose all things? And then verse 14, the earth takes shape like clay under a seal. It features stand out like those of a garment. And so he just paints this picture of how he formed the land, how he formed the earth, and it continues to just paint that picture of creation and how he formed it all together. And then it's just another aspect that he picks up. He says in verse 16, have you journeyed to the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the deepest darkness? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. He is really taking Job and he's saying, go and tell me. Have you seen these things? Have you observed them? Who is in control of these things? Who is over these things? A really marvelous picture that we get painted. You read Genesis and you're in awe of the creation account, but here Job is shown by God a picture in many ways firsthand by God, saying, let me show you how I created it. Let me demonstrate for you. Think about this earth. Think about the seas. Think about the land. Think about how it's put together. Who holds it together? Who contains it all? Who called it into being? And he says, really look at it. Consider it. And then verse 19, what is the way what is the way to the abode of light, and where does darkness reside? Again, that picture of the sun and moon, or day and night, is that picture of not only light and darkness, but that picture of how God brought about day and night. An incredible picture that we have painted. And then verse 22, he takes Job even further into the stars, if you want to put it that way. And he says there, have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or seen the storehouses of hail, which I reserve for times of trouble, for days of war and battle? And so here he's lifting off the earth, if you can have that picture, and he's saying, consider the storehouses, consider how they house the rain, the snow, and all those things. And then he goes a little bit further on as we keep going out, drifting further and further. Eventually we get to verse 31, where you get that picture. He says, can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Can you loosen Orion's belt? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons, or lead out the bear with its cubs? And so what's really beautiful about this picture is, if you think of the order in which it's painted for Job, he says, okay, firstly, consider the foundations. Consider the very ground that you're standing on. Consider how I have created that. Now consider the next thing, how I've raised things out of the ground, how I've shaped the ground, I've molded it like clay. And now consider something a little bit higher than that. Consider the heavens, the heavens within this world, the storehouses of rain and snow, and then go and consider even further the heavens, the constellations, the stars. And you see, it's almost like God is zooming out from earth, and he's saying, okay, you're here, you're on earth, you understand the foundations, but let me show you, as we go further and further and further out, it becomes all the more marvelous, all the more incredible and great, and you can barely even see them and understand all of them. And so God paints this incredible picture for Job to just consider that God holds all these things together. God has orchestrated, God has constructed these things, God has made them possible. And who is Job in light of that? God has created all things in his wisdom. And so as the Lord shows Job here these incredible images, these incredible things that we can see every day of our lives. You can get up tomorrow morning, you can walk out and you can see the sunrise, or you can consider maybe it's raining again, or you see where the rain is falling from. How does that work? We have so many people exploring how all of these things work together, how rain comes about, and why sometimes it does rain and sometimes it doesn't rain, and how the stars work, and how marvelous they are, and how they are ordered, and how we are positioned in this place that we are within our galaxy or the solar system or wherever. And it becomes so complicated and we can't fully fathom. But for those that turn to God's word, you're awestruck. You absolutely are in awe of who God is, because he's the one that holds it all together. We can't even begin to manipulate and control those things. And what's so beautiful about the picture is God says to Job, consider the foundations of the earth. Where were you when I formed those? Now, when you think about it, you can walk outside after watching this video and you can feel the earth, and maybe you can change the shape of it. You can build a house on it. And you can manipulate, if you want to think in that way, the foundations. But on a cosmic level, you have no control. You cannot do that. And the further out you go, the less control you have. You can't control when it rains, or at least you can't control perhaps the full extent of how it rains. Watching something recently, seeing how we are trying to now stimulate rain is phenomenal. But we still are limited beings. We cannot control things in that way. And the further out we go, when when we enter into the territory of space, we have absolutely no control at all whatsoever. And so this is marvelous for us to just consider and see the immense complexities of how God has created it. And so as Job is hearing this, we should also be in awe of how God has created what he has created in his absolute wisdom, that we cannot even begin to conceive and create and to do anything like what God has done here. And then notice the first thing that, the first time that a creature is mentioned. So up until this point, it's been very much static. It's been God's creation through the earth, through the stars, through not living organisms. Now he turns to living organisms in verse 36. He says, who gives the ibis wisdom, or gives the rooster understanding? And so what is unique about this is the very first creature that he looks at, he highlights wisdom and understanding. And he says, who gives the ibis wisdom? Who gives the rooster understanding? Who has the wisdom to count the clouds? Who can tip over the water jars of the heavens? When the dust becomes hard and the clods of the earth stick together. Who can do that? Who has created in incredible wisdom? And then we go from verse 39 of chapter 38 all the way into chapter 39, and that's all the way to the end. And the Lord paints this incredible picture for us of now creatures, of the creatures that he has made. Look at verse 39, for example. Do you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions, or lie in when they crouch in their dens, or lie in wait in a thicket? Who provides food for the raven when its young cry out to God and wander about for lack of food? And so it's this really incredible picture that we get painted again for us as the Lord now expands, and he paints this picture for Job and says, now consider creatures. How are they sustained? How are they looked after? Do you go out and hunt for them? No, they are designed in a way that they are able to hunt. They know what to do. This is how I have designed them. This is how I have made them. And as you look at all these creatures, there are these things that get highlighted for us that really get us to consider just the complexity in how these creatures have been made. Possibly one of my favorite ones that gets highlighted is the ostrich. It's absolutely bizarre that here there's this picture painted for the ostrich, and listen to this in verse 13. It says, the wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, though they cannot compare with the wings and feathers of the stork. She lays her eggs on the ground and lets them warm in the sand, unmindful that a foot may crush them, that some wild animal may trample them. She treats her young harshly, as if they were not hers. She cares not that her labor was in vain, for God did not endow her with wisdom or give her a share of good sense. Yet, when she spreads her feathers to run, she laughs at the horse and rider. When you look at an animal like an ostrich, you think it's a bird. It should fly. It shouldn't lay its eggs on the ground. But yet that's what it does. And yet, in some ways, an ostrich has no wisdom. It seems like an unsensible, silly creature in many ways. But yet it is designed to be able to run incredibly fast, like no other bird. But also it competes against horses. I mean, an incredible picture. We haven't designed that. We didn't create the ostrich. We didn't put it together. But here God demonstrates that he has created it how he wanted to create it. And it is incredible. It is beautiful. Bizarre, perhaps, but incredible. Absolutely incredible. And so we get these pictures painted for us in this section as the Lord shows Job that there are these creatures that he has created. And just to pause there are moments throughout the discourses that Job has with the friends that animals are even mentioned. There is the donkey that gets mentioned. There is even the eagle that gets mentioned. And here God highlights them according to his wisdom. And he says they might seem silly creatures to you, or you might use them to compare yourselves. But look at these creatures, for I designed them in my wisdom. They might not look like they have wisdom, but they are designed according to my wisdom. God creates in his wisdom, and things make sense in his wisdom. We might look at them and feel that it makes no sense at all. And that might be true for most of life. We look around us and often we have the question, how does that work? Why is it like that? Why would God do that? Well, because that's who God is, and it doesn't need to make sense to us for it to be wise or sensible. But God is the one that constructs and creates all things in his wisdom. So when you consider now, just briefly for a moment, when you consider Job's life, it gets you to realize that when you ask the question, why has this happened to Job? It helps you to perhaps see that perhaps that's not the most helpful question to ask. Not why has this happened to Job, but who is the wise one in light of Job's circumstance. God has permitted it, and there is a reason for God permitting it. And in light of what God has permitted to happen to Job, it is done in God's absolute wisdom. God hasn't done it maliciously. He's not done it with evil intention, but he has done it with wisdom. God has demonstrated something of himself through the suffering of Job. He has demonstrated his wisdom not only to Job, but through Job for others. So when we look at Job today, we don't look at Job to see how we can be like Job. Instead, we look at Job to see the incredible depth of God's wisdom, and that sometimes in this life we cannot explain things in the way that we would like. We would like to construct it in a neat way that makes sense and keeps everybody happy. We'd like to keep the peace among people, that when we give them an answer about why things happen in a peculiar way, that it makes sense. But when it comes to God's wisdom, it so often disarms us. It doesn't give us grounds to explain away situations or circumstances. Instead, it puts us into a peculiar position where we are denied our own words, that we cannot speak, we cannot answer, because we don't always have the depth of understanding and wisdom that the Lord has. We may try, like the friends did throughout the book of Job, trying to understand, trying to demonstrate wisdom, and their wisdom finds itself diminishing as the Lord speaks here, and as we see the bigger picture, that God doesn't simply do stuff that has to make sense according to man. And that's perhaps why I like just the picture of the ostrich. If I had to play that game for a moment and imagine if I were God, what would I do? I would want to say, well, all birds are supposed to fly because that makes sense. All fish are supposed to swim because that's how it's supposed to be. But yet it doesn't have to be that way. God can create in his incredible and unique way. And here you have a bird, for example, that though in our understanding it should fly, it doesn't fly. You can throw it off a cliff and it still won't fly just because you're throwing it off a cliff. And as silly as that seems, it shows us that it is incredibly complex when we think about God's wisdom. And when we look at Job's life, perhaps you've been wrestling with this for the weeks that we've been looking at this and saying, but this doesn't make sense. Why would God allow Job to endure such suffering if he was blameless, if he was upright, if he feared God, and if he shunned evil? Why would God allow it? Well, because God is wise. That is the answer here. God is wise. Not because it makes sense to us, but because God permits things to happen. God permits things to unfold because he has an incredible plan. He has a purpose. He has something to demonstrate and show us. And that he doesn't fit the boxes that we set out for him. We cannot box God. We cannot put him into a framework of thinking and say, this is how God is. We can get glimpses of it. We can grasp at things. And just when we think we might understand how God functions, he will surprise us. And I think that's perhaps what happened with the friends. They had grown to understand how God thinks and does and how he's acted in the past. And suddenly God is demonstrating here something all uniquely different to what they expected. Job does not fit the mold of what their culture would say. Job doesn't fit the mold of if you have done wrong, bad things will happen to you. No, Job has done nothing wrong. He's blameless, he is upright, he fears God, he shuns evil, and yet he suffers hardship. How bizarre. But this is done in God's incredible wisdom. This is permitted in God's incredible wisdom. Maybe that doesn't comfort you. Maybe that gives you incredible comfort. But perhaps when you consider the gospel today, you see Jesus Christ. And you look at the situation. Here is a man If you look at him purely as a man, he enters this world, he lives a perfect life, absolutely spotless, without blemish, and he is hung on a cross to die. He is murdered and mocked and mutilated by crowds of people that spit and jeer at him. For what? He has done nothing wrong, but it is done in God's incredible wisdom. Jesus Christ demonstrates for us all the more far greater, far deeper wisdom than Job ever has. Because when we look at Jesus, nothing makes sense there. He is the Son of God that enters this world. Jesus, God incarnate, dying on a cross for our sins so that we can be saved. How beautiful. How incredible. The question is, do you fear the Lord? Do you love Him? Are you in awe of Him? Do you see how incredible His wisdom is? Are you willing to let His wisdom outshine anything that you can put on display? Your understanding, your knowledge. He is far greater than that. He's far greater than you. He's far greater than me. How incredible is God's wisdom? And what I'll end off with is this. Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him. Will Job say something? Will Job be able to contend with what God has revealed to him? That is the big question. And we aren't going to look at that today. I think I'm going to leave that for us for next week, just to see just a brief little thing that Job does have to say. And we conclude there, just as we weigh up and soak in the incredible wisdom that the Lord has demonstrated for us through this passage. Go and read it, soak in it, enjoy it, be in awe of God's incredible wisdom as He has created the foundations of the earth all the way to the immense cosmic, chaotic, confusing universe out there. As He zooms out for us, may you sit and reflect on that for a moment and just see His incredible wisdom that He has created all things in. Have a great day, and we'll see you all next week. Cheers, bye.